Hello my friends, this tutorial is going to be about making selections in Photoshop, and it will actually be a two-parter. In this video we will specifically be talking about how to photograph the objects that you're going to be using in your composite image in such a way that it will be easy for you to select them once you get those pictures into Photoshop. So that's why we are standing here in a studio and we're set up to do a shoot. In the second video, we will actually take these images into Photoshop and I will show you the different techniques for selecting your objects. Now, the actual act of taking the photos and doing it right can make a huge difference in how easy or difficult it's going to be for you to make your selections in Photoshop. So many of us out there are doing composite images where we're combining a whole bunch of different images together in order to make a more interesting and exciting composition. And when we bring those images into Photoshop, we need to be taking into consideration how it is that Photoshop reads the image in order to make your selection. And basically what Photoshop is looking for is contrast. It's looking for color contrast, it's looking for tonal contrast between lights to darks, and this is how it determines where the edges of your objects are. So the more contrast that you have from your subject to your background, or between your subject and your background, the easier it is going to be for Photoshop to say, okay, that's what they want selected, and bam, just kind of do it for you without you having to go in and do a lot of detailed work to clean those selections up. Now, of course, there are instances in which you really just don't have the kind of control that you need over the situation to set things up in this ideal manner. And in the future, we will do a tutorial on how to make those trickier selections. But for now, let's just talk about how to plan ahead and make sure that your images of the objects you're going to be using are shot in the best possible way for you to make those selections in Photoshop. So what we're doing with our orchid here is I'm going to be shooting it against a white background, and I'm going to make it basically a solid white background because this will make it extremely easy for us to select this pink and green orchid when we get it into Photoshop. So how am I going about doing that? I have set up my gray backdrop and I have two lights that are pointing at that, so they're illuminating it quite well. And basically what I'm going to do, what I have already done, is set my exposure so that that backdrop is going to go completely white. So I need to be letting enough light into the camera to bring that background up to white. And in order to do that without overexposing my subject, I need to make sure that my main light is not too close to my subject, because we know from the inverse square law that the closer your lighting source is to your subject, the brighter and more intense the light falling on your subject will be. The further away your lighting source is from your subject, the more dim, I guess you could say, the light falling on your subject will be. So that will make it so that it'll be okay for us to pop our exposure up and let enough light into our camera to get that really nice white background. So what I have done, I'm just going to tell you my settings here. I've got an ISO of 1600, an f-stop of 5.6, and I'm at 1/60th of a second. So some of you may not like to shoot at ISO 1600, and that's understandable. I personally have no problem with that. I don't mind a little bit of grain in my images. I actually like that. And with this camera, it's really not going to make much grain at all anyways. However, if you don't like that, then you can change your lighting setup, or you can always use a tripod. Typically, I would actually be putting my camera on a tripod. The reason that I'm not doing that right now is because I'm using the tripod for my video camera. So I don't have an additional tripod for this particular tutorial. So it's actually good to do this on a tripod even if you're okay with ISO 1600 or whatever, because when you're not hand holding the camera, you're just going to get sharper focus, and you're also going to be able to really shut down your aperture and get a nice depth of field on your objects, which when you're doing composite imagery is typically very important. You want to get a nice depth of field on the objects that you're going to be adding into your scene so that it doesn't cause any issues with the way that the focus is working in the overall image. So for now, we're just talking about selections, which means that the settings that I have will be just fine for our purposes. Let's just go ahead and take a shot of this. Okay, so that is perfect. We've already got our background solid white, and our subject is nicely exposed and not overexposed. So one thing that you will want to do, should you decide to do a solid white background like this, is you will definitely want to check your histogram or tether your camera and look at it in Lightroom or Capture One or whatever it is that you're using, so that you can make sure that the white background really is white, because sometimes it's going to look white and then you get it into Photoshop and it's not. So in this instance, typically we would say that we don't want any peaking, right? We don't want our highlights to on our graph to go all the way over to the right hand side of our histogram. But in this case, we actually do want to see that. We want to see that our histogram is all the way up against that right edge of our graph, because that means that that white background is truly white. So in this case, it looks like that is definitely what we're getting. So all I'm going to do now is just take a few different shots to get some different angles and things, and then we will grab a different object. So many of you already know that I typically take a few different shots with different angles. One thing that is good about these orchids is that they're all these little flowers are lined up on this one stem that's kind of shooting out from the plant. So these three orchids here on the top are all kind of on the similar focal plane. So if I get them nice and straight in my composition, I should still get a pretty good depth of field there, even if I am using an f-stop like 5.6. So let's just take one more shot here. Okay, that's perfect. So now we're going to change this up a little bit, and we're going to shoot a different object. I'm just going to tip this up and grab another apple box and stick that on top of there. And then I'm actually going to lay down a white tablecloth over the top of this. And the reason for this is because I'm going to be setting an object that we're going to be photographing on here. And I would like for there to still be that contrast between the object and whatever it's going to be placed on. So what we're going to be using this time is a little piece of driftwood. So I found this driftwood at a lake near me, and I thought it was really cool because to me it looks like an animal's skull. So I thought that it would be an interesting object to use. And I'm putting it on a little stand. The reason for that is that if I can get this up above the apple box here, almost as though it's floating in space, this is going to make it easier for me to select it again in Photoshop, because if I have it setting on here, I still may have a little bit of a tricky time with some of the areas where it touches the cloth. Probably not too much really in this instance, but if there's more shadows and things, then it's definitely going to get a little tough where it's touching other objects. So if we can raise it up so that it's not really touching anything else, that's really going to be ideal. Now let's see if I can balance it on here. I think I might need a little counterweight for that. So let me grab this thing. Okay. Can we get you on there now, guy? Okay. So there we go. We've got our skull, or our driftwood, I should say. Another thing that you may want to think about in this particular instance is that this driftwood is a pretty light color. So is it going to contrast enough with our white background? In this instance, I think it will. But if we take the photograph and we decide that we don't think it is contrasting enough, we can actually change this to a black background, and that will make it so that we can easily select it. So let's go ahead and take a shot of it and see what we think. So I'm keeping my settings the same. I'm pretty sure it should be fine, but we'll double check. Oh yeah, it's definitely gonna be just fine. Okay, so this actually already looks perfect. And you'll notice that it's totally separated from the apple box and the tablecloth here, so that it really is kind of like floating, which is going to make this super easy to select. We won't have any problems with that. So what we're going to do now is we are going to change objects again, but this time we're actually going to use a black background. So I'm going to swap this with a black piece of cloth, which I have here. And then we're going to be photographing a piece of coral that some of you guys may recognize because it's something that I use in the master class. So this is just a black piece of cloth that I typically use for this kind of thing, or sometimes as negative fill, so basically to block light. And I've even used it as an impromptu black background, because you can just tape it with gaffer's tape to a wall or something like that. So it has a lot of uses. And let's go ahead and grab our little coral. Now this one, we're not going to be able to have it floating quite as much because it really needs this stand to kind of set up properly. But what I'm doing is I'm trying to rest it on the stand in such a way that the stand isn't majorly blocking any pieces of the coral that I think are important and that I'm going to want in my composition. And there may be a few tricky areas here, but in this particular lighting scenario, I don't think there really will be. So let's go ahead and turn off our background lights, because for this one, we won't want a white background, right? This is a white object. So if we have a white object on a white background, that's actually going to be difficult to select because there's no contrast again. We've just got white on white. So to create the contrast that we need, we're going to make the background black by turning off our background lights. And to enhance this, we're going to actually feather our light, and we are also probably going to pull the subject forward a little bit, hopefully without knocking it over. Oh, see, I'm already about to knock it over. Let's pull it forward. So the further I have it off of that background, the darker the background's gonna get. The further away that the light is from that background, the darker it's gonna get. And I'm going to do something called feathering the light. So essentially what that means is I'm just turning the light away from the subject and the background. So that's going to diminish the light that's falling on the background. And it's also going to soften the light a bit on the subject and dim it a bit. So I may have to move my light in a little closer, but it should be okay because our exposure is going to change in that we'll now have a brighter subject, which means that that will actually make our background darker. Because if we're going to have to lower our exposure, let less light into the camera in order to get a proper exposure of our subject, that's going to mean that that background will just get darker as well. So I think we're okay about where we have it now. Let's take a look and see. Okay, so I'm definitely going to have to change my settings for this. So I'm going to go to F8, so that's good. We'll be getting more depth of field. And I'm just picking a focal point. And I think this is actually fine because we don't need it to be solid black for this. This is plenty of contrast to select this object quite easily. It's basically a dark gray that we're getting now. If we really, really, really wanted that background to be black, we could either put a black backdrop up, that would be the easiest way to do it, or we can just further feather the light or even bring in flags to block light from the background. But I think if we just feather the light a little bit more, that will help quite a bit. So I'm just turning my light even further away from my background. And we're just gonna pull it like that too. Okay. So hopefully we're still getting enough light on our object here. And let's see what that looks like. Okay. That is perfect. There is a little bit of light still falling on the background and making it a bit brighter on one side than the other, but it really doesn't matter. It's plenty dark for our purposes. So I think that's it. We have our objects photographed. So that will be it for this portion of the tutorial. And in the next tutorial, we will show how I go about selecting these objects in Photoshop.